Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, X1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 1 up.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 79, Mach 2.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super up, line 3, red ball, avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for light in the gear handle.
Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. This month's top tier Patreon shoutout goes to Robbie Walker, Travis Barnes, Kevin Traw, JT Owens, Delinda Baker, and Matt Jones. Thanks for the support. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, nor the formation of an attorney-client relationship. Okay, so today I'm joined by someone that I've known for, probably a year and a half, 2 years now, Christa?
Yep.
So I'm joined by Christa Vo, who is in school with me. And today we're going to talk about the cybersecurity of the United States, her research on the topic, and what that kind of means for national defense. And it's kind of a very fortunate time that you just completed this research project, because now we're currently facing this pipeline ransomware sort of hack going on the East Coast, which was really kind of accelerated the time, because we were going to do this podcast anyway, but it felt very timely to do it now. But if you'd like to, let's rewind a little bit. I guess tell me about your background and how you came to law school and how you decided on this particular topic.
Oh, that's going to be quite a story. Okay. I took about 11 years off from college before I came to law school, and had 4 kids. Was a stay-at-home mom for a while. Then I got back into the workforce, worked for an insurance company, worked for the local government. And what got me back into law school was wanting to have a say in how things are structured, and specifically getting frustrated with how laws are written and enforced. And so I think a legal education opens a lot of doors as far as enforcing law and figuring out what laws should be and things like that.
So what made you so part of our education is we have to write an advanced sort of research paper, and you just completed that. And what was it on?
It was on cybersecurity in the maritime shipping industry. And I arrived at that topic because I had started taking some of the classes about information privacy that our school offers, and there's a certificate program that I'm part of. So last summer I did the Summer Privacy Institute, which was a 2-week program where we just spent all day studying information privacy. And so that was interesting. And then this year I took a maritime law class because my advisor talked me into it. He was the professor. And it actually was very interesting. And I found that I could combine the 2 topics pretty easily into a paper. And it was based around a hack that happened in 2017 that shut down the operations of Maersk, which is a Danish shipping company, for like 2 weeks. And they had to completely throw out all their computers, all their servers, everything, and start over. They luckily were able to back up everything in about 2 weeks, but their normal operations took a couple months to really recover. And it was mostly luck that they were able to recover that quickly, because one of their offices was experiencing a power outage. So the computers in that office had not been infected because they were offline.
Oh, that's interesting. So actually, you kind of are a bit clairvoyant on this particular topic. For one, while you were in this class and working on this, we had obviously the most recent cyber attack against our infrastructure for the oil pipeline. But concurrent with the class, there was also the issue of the stuck ship in the canal, right?
Yeah, so that the Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez Canal happened while I was writing this paper and researching it. And they are pretty sure what happened with that was more of a sort of mechanical failure or user error kind of thing. But the ship ran aground and hit both sides of the canal and then disrupted shipping worldwide for, I don't know, 7 days, I think, or 9 days or something.
But I guess the issue is, while you're working on this, there was a cyber attack on our infrastructure and a meme ship stuck in a canal.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what are you taking next semester so we can anticipate world events that are going to go awry with whatever you're studying? Right. You're doing info privacy again in the fall, aren't you?
I am. So maybe we can solve problems by next semester and we can, I don't know, or maybe it's all going to go worse. I mean, okay, so the premise of my paper is that the US needs to do a lot better in our cybersecurity policy and organization of how the government handles it. Because right now, different departments don't talk to each other. And by the time they do, something's already happened. And I mean, last year we had the SolarWinds hack that was undetected for almost all of 2020 until December.
Yeah, so
from March till December.
Let's back up a little bit. And first of all, also I'll do the caveat, which I'm sure Chris will agree to. We are not qualified to give legal advice, and this podcast is more of, I know Christa just did a real deep dive on cybersecurity as it relates to kind of logistics and infrastructure and things like that. So what she's going to provide is what her research kind of discovered, but we're not advising anyone for anything. But with that caveat, I guess let's do, you talked about cybersecurity as related to maritime, and you talked about, what was it, the SolarWinds?
Mm-hmm.
So in your research, what were some of the things that surprised you about what you discovered? As you kind of messaged me offline, what kept you up at night when you saw things? Like, what were those things that you didn't know about, and what probably a lot of these listeners don't know about?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing that kept me up at night is really just realizing the extent of our vulnerability, I think, worldwide, to just having our infrastructure really shut down and messed with. And as soon as I turned in my paper on Friday, the next day the news broke, I think it was Saturday, that this pipeline had been hacked, and now it's causing this huge disruption and people are panicking. And it's been kind of eye-opening to see, first of all, how automated a lot of our infrastructure is and how much we rely on various, corporations to regulate themselves, because the government's not really doing it. The next big thing that surprised me was how we do have a dedicated government agency called the CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, I think it's called. They rely on voluntary participation from companies, and they don't have any enforcement powers. They can't force any companies to do anything that they're not willing to do. And so they're really relying on each of the individual stakeholders to come up with their own self-regulating, basically, and talk to each other and try to strategize about how to prevent attacks, but they're not given any kind of uniform plan of what they should be doing. They sort of help assess attacks and assess vulnerabilities, but there's no real enforcement capability of what they tell people. They can't force them to do anything. They can write directives that government agencies have to follow. However, there's exceptions to their power within the government. They cannot force the Department of Defense to do anything. They can't force any of the intelligence agencies to do anything, because they all handle their own cybersecurity. So even though we have this dedicated agency that's supposed to be sort of the centralized cybersecurity thing, they're not. So
that's interesting. And I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. So there's a centralized agency that kind of is there to make sure everyone has some minimum standard for cybersecurity in whatever it is they're doing. However, they don't have actual enforcement power, and the little enforcement power they have can't be applied against certain government agencies like the DoD or the CIA or any of those, because it's assumed those are going to have a much higher standard for cyber awareness and info security, which is pretty ironic because a lot of people listening to this, you've gone through info assurance and info protection training. Much of it is like from 2009 with the guy trying to give you your mixtape, or every answer is pulling out your common access card before you go and do anything. Spoiler, that's the answer to 90% of the exam. But, you also talked about how it's expected that corporations are going to kind of regulate themselves. And that harkens back to what we learned. I use the term learned loosely here. What we learned in business associations in the fall, where there's like a fiduciary duty to your shareholders that you have to essentially, you're required to, as a company, as a publicly traded company or any company with shareholders, you're required to make essentially the most amount of money possible. So what it creates is, again, I'm not an expert. This is not legal advice, but what it creates is this pressure to maximize profits, which is going to maximize efficiency. And very often safety or security, certainly cybersecurity, those are all expensive overhead things. And they're also proactive rather than reactive. Like you have to spend the money and like you'll dump a bunch of money into safety and cybersecurity and you'll never know if your money is worthwhile because you'll never be attacked, right? And like you don't know if what you're spending is enough. And if these companies are constantly trying to maximize their bottom line, at some point there's a risk versus reward comparison. And until there are ongoing cyber attacks, they're not going to necessarily do anything. And with that, I assume we've been doing this for the last 50 years when computers and automation has crept into industry, private industry. Certainly we're talking about industry like power systems, other utilities, internet, all of these things, anywhere that ransomware kind of strikes. I know there's some cities in America that had ransomware hit on like their city networks, and they had to like purge their entire municipal everything and rebuild. So like the money we saved over the last 50 years in not having a strong sort of defense against cyber attacks might have saved us money in the short term. But I think what we're really getting now is we're starting to see the long-term costs of having that lower standard, and also expecting companies to be able to have the foresight to know what would be required in the future. Because the reality is a lot of these cyber attacks could have happened decades ago, implanted into hardware, firmware, software, or whatever, and it's just been sitting and waiting, and some are being sprung. But I kind of wanted, I touched on a bunch of stuff there, but I know we talked briefly that there is some I know we talked offline briefly. There is some legislation or some actions taking place in Congress. So what are some of the fixes that are suggested into at least starting to address this problem?
Yeah, so one of the things you just said actually was part of the premise of my paper, which is that we can take what Maersk did in reaction to their attack and how they handled it, which is they threw everything out and started over. And then from then on, their IT department said, it's been so easy to get the company to pay for upgrades that we need because they see in real life what the consequences are for them to their bottom line if they don't. So they've had their systems upgraded. They pay for all the latest software now and all the patches that need to be installed and all that kind of stuff. So there was this group of so it was Senator Angus King from Maine, and I can't remember the other guy's name.
That's okay. The only important one's Angus King.
Angus King's all that matters. He's great.
I just want to put that on the record. I mentioned Maine probably every other podcast, so we've hit that quota, so we're good. Awesome.
So the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was established in 2020, or I guess they were established in 2019 because they gave their report in 2020. And they came up with this sort of comprehensive plan to overhaul US cybersecurity policy. And it seems great. It prioritizes things like one thing we've already done is appoint a national cybersecurity director to sort of oversee everything. So they can sort of coordinate all the efforts between all the departments and all that kind of stuff. They suggest strengthening CISA and giving it more ability to actually do the work it's supposed to be doing, including giving it a bigger budget because their operating budget is fairly small. And so that means they are very limited in what they can actually accomplish and probably the kind of talent they can retain, because we know that companies like Google and Facebook and all these giant tech companies pay people really well and have great benefits. And not a lot of people are going to necessarily leave that world to go work for the government when they get everything that Google's going to give them. So I think if there's bigger budgets allocated towards cybersecurity, that you can retain the kind of talent that you're going to need to do that kind of work. Then also, if we can prioritize prevention and developing resilient systems that will be able to withstand any kind of attempted attacks and not allow the attacks to be successful, pairing that with also making it less lucrative for attackers. So if they're trying to do ransomware, sometimes that's to raise money and through things like cryptocurrencies. And if you have a system that ransomware can't get a hold of and can't manage to take over and lock down and hold something ransom, then why would people even keep trying? Because there's no point if you can't be successful to get your end goal. Some of these attacks are ransomware, but it's not intended as the financial part is it's sort of like just a way to get in. They use a ransomware and change it a little bit to be more destructive. That's what happened with the attack that I read the most about with Maersk. But they were more intending to, so it was a Russian group that was targeting Ukraine, and they were actively involved in a border dispute at the time. So this was sort of like a tool within that dispute to mess with Ukraine's power grid and their financial system and all kinds of other really important infrastructure that is now digital. So, I mean, the implications for what a cyber attack can mean is not always just that we're going to have to sort of rebuild systems and things like that. It could have really not great results internationally as far as if people decide that military response is something they want to do. And there's all this sort of scholarship about attribution of cyber attacks. So how do you figure out if Russia's denying that they were a part of it or that these people work for them? Or, I mean,
yeah, that was, I was going to ask you too, when you're talking about the ransomware. So, you know, when I think ransomware, I usually think I mean, I guess we'll put a bow on it and call it an independent contractor. I mean, that's probably more noble of a term than I should be using, but it's like an independent contractor, and maybe it's a small group of people that are computer savvy and understand, you know, there's probably some psychological stuff going on, phishing for passwords, any number of things going on all at once. We have probably a very small team that's very good at what they're doing, and their job is to find a way to lock out a particular system that's going to create a financial burden on whoever system is being locked out to coerce them into giving up a whole bunch of money. But it seems to me their customer may not just be the person they're extorting. If they are, you know, working in another country, they could very well sell that access to a state actor that wants access to those systems, or simply, here's the methodology we use to gain access to that system. It worked here. It'll probably work here, 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 and here. And those may not be direct sort of state actors. But I think, especially what we've seen over the last 20 years, you're talking about, like, there was that worm virus or whatever that destroyed the centrifuges in Iran. And those were like air-gapped computers. So it took a lot of air gap computers are computers that are not hooked to the internet. They are off the network, and so something has to be introduced into them physically in order to create a sort of malicious code. And centrifuges, and it was something so small. It was like the balances centrifuges were thrown off in order to kind of have them it's like throwing a brick in your washing machine. Eventually it's going to spin itself to death type of deal. But when you look at that, look at the ransomware going on, and then when you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about the oil pipeline, even though it may not be, it's 7% or whatever amount it is it's used on the East Coast or whatever. It makes me concerned that all the horses are already out of the barn on this, is what it feels like.
If you look at somebody was able to penetrate that system for that pipeline, and then you look at, okay, over the winter, look what happened in Texas when their power grid went down, and it wasn't a cyber attack that did that, but look at the devastation and how many people died. And if some state actor decided that they really wanted to do something that would hurt us, it's right there, and there's not a lot preventing somebody from doing that. And that's the scary part, is that
it seems like those operations are fairly low budget in the grand scheme of international affairs compared to what we're talking about. In order to create a robust sort of cyber firewall against these outside attacks to these important sort of infrastructure, power grids, all these other things, I think it's probably, we're talking billions of dollars in order to secure billions and or trillions over a certain period of time to secure the United States cyber arena, versus you're probably talking in the millions for expenses to lob attacks right now.
It's not that we don't have the budget to do that, but I think that there's not a good way to have a lot of insight into military budgets, as you probably know. You get limited information. You can't necessarily pinpoint which department is getting what and all that kind of stuff. So I would guess that the cyber force part of the Department of Defense does not get billions and trillions of dollars. I would guess that they get maybe millions.
Well, I'll tell you what, since you are a non-military person and a lot of military people are listening to this, I'll spin you up real quick. And I'm not trying to disparage those that exist in the cyber field, but the reality is, if you're a concert pianist, or you don't need to be in tip-top physical shape. You probably have to have a lot of manual dexterity and a lot of muscle memory here, but you don't need to be able to run 1.5 miles in a certain amount of time. And the inverse of that is, if you're an NBA basketball player, you don't need to know quantum mechanics, right?
Right.
Like, those are two different things. But unfortunately, the way the military treats cyber is, if you're a military member, you have to maintain certain standards that are completely divorced from your performance in your job. And what we're doing is, especially, I'm just a guy that's reading the news, but when you're talking about the average American is, their BMI is really high, and the generals that run the services are concerned that the current fitness standards are going to basically make a large portion of military age people incapable of serving, and they need to adjust their standards or fix the health of the nation for national security reasons. But what we're doing is we are, the compensation compared to, like you said earlier, Google and Apple and all these other places is just in the toilet. You're talking, if you're working for Google as a cyber security expert, and that's who we want. We don't want people that are fledgling out of like these schools that lost their accreditation over the last 10 or 15 years, pumping out IT experts, quote unquote, not to disparage anybody that happened to go through that. But, we want the preeminent expert, because they are going to build the network that's going to protect our nation's like defense force against what we know is, and it's not if we get a cyber attack against our military, it's when, and we probably already have, right? Like, that's very likely to have already happened, and we can't compensate. We're not paying them. You're talking Silicon Valley, Google, an IT expert is probably making $400,000 a year or more, probably, the type of people we're looking for. And we would have to enlist them at as a 4-star general, sitting in a room with a computer and a laser mouse with like RGB memory in their computer. It's like, that's not going to happen. Like, there's a real problem here that I think cyber defense is incompatible with the military structure in every single way it needs to be. I think it is embarrassing that we developed a space force before we developed an independent cyber response, because I think in the here and now, cyber is the more immediate threat than laser satellites. I'll say I do.
I mean, and also if you look at the approach that our government takes in hiring also, I mean, if you have somebody who's an expert in hacking and these kind of attacks and maybe how to think like the people who are doing these attacks, they may not have a clean criminal record, and they may have done things in their past that have gotten them, a status that the government might not want to hire them. But Russia is miles ahead of us in certain ways as far as using cyber offensively. And I know that we have that capability, and maybe we just don't hear about it a lot, but if we could pivot it to really be defensive, I think that's what would be necessary at this point. And
so you're absolutely right. I happen to follow a gentleman on social media named Marcus Hutchins, who is a young man who was an IT expert, and I think a lot of it was self-taught, which I think a lot of these people are. It's self-taught. Yep. It's like a passion thing. And he, if anybody remembers, there was a global ransomware called Wannacry, and it was basically they had just figured out that a bunch of computers were infected through a sort of backdoor, and I think it had just started to be tripped, and it was cascading around the globe, and it was basically going to hold a large amount of systems hostage for an ungodly amount of cryptocurrency. And this young man who's 26, 27 years old now, at the time it was, like 3 or 4 years ago at least,
that was like 2016.
Yeah, he found a website in the code, and he went to the website, and essentially it was the kill switch for the entire ransomware worldwide. And once it was killed, it was dead. And he essentially, like, literally, this guy, it's like, it's the most cliche thing ever. It's a guy in a basement. He essentially saved untold billions of dollars in expenses, this ransomware. And the way he got good at what he did was because previously he engaged in very minor ransomware efforts. Like, that's how he learned how to do it. And a year after he basically saved the world, he was in Las Vegas at a hacker, like a white hat hacker convention, and the FBI picked him up and arrested him for some low level ransomware that he had coded, a few years prior to, like, unrelated to the Wannacry. He wasn't involved in the Wannacry. He essentially saved a bunch of money. But how he developed those skills was engaging in this sort of seedy sort of process. And when you're talking about security clearances where you have to have a pristine, perfect record, like, you can't engage in these acts. Another way the military is closing the door to really experienced people is by having this: you can't have ever committed any crime ever in your past in order to be a part of our team. Like, we are literally creating a standard that makes people less proficient at what we need them to do.
It's true. And besides that, I mean, what you already mentioned about the physical standards that you have to meet to enter the military, I have had contact from, I don't know, half a dozen recruiters since I went to law school saying, hey, did you know that we offer scholarships for, pay off your student loans with joining the military, be a military lawyer? And every single time I have to say to them, I'm medically disqualified. I can't join the military, much as I would love to be like a JAG lawyer or something. I can't. So,
spoiler, you wouldn't love it, by the way.
Well, I would love to have my debt magically erased. That'd be cool. But I mean, it seems kind of arbitrary to take somebody who is going to be doing a very specific job and say, you have to meet these standards that are designed to ensure that people who are on battlefields are going to be safe and like the best at what they're doing. And that doesn't apply broadly anymore. That's not what really I don't think our military should look like anymore, given that around the world, that's not really what's happening. What's happening is that people are investing, or countries are investing in cyber teams that can do these kind of crazy take it downs of Ukraine's power grid, for example.
No, and much like I advocated in episode 35 for the changes of the physical fitness and physical fitness testing and training, I think it should be should not be career impacting. It should not preclude people from serving at all whatsoever. And it goes to the point of, I would rather have somebody that's really highly proficient at their job that doesn't require these physical requirements, so that way they can get the mission done and get it done right. I think we are trying to create this baseline that is actually hurting national security. And what's going to end up happening is we're going to contract out all of these things, and it's going to cost through the nose to get it done. But I want to circle back to, the automation. Like, so much of our infrastructure is automated, and a lot of that automation was created not recently. Mm-hmm. I mean, this might age me a little bit, and it'll age you too, unfortunately. Like, I remember the Y2K panic.
Oh yeah.
Like, I was in the military when the year 2000 was going to come up, and I think it was like 3 or 4 years before, maybe 3 or 4 years before it came into the national consciousness of, hey, all the computers are set to 2-digit years. So when it flips to 2000, all the computers are going to think it's 1900. And, look, I was dumb and I bought into it. And on the New Year's Eve of 2000, when it hit midnight, I was standing by an ATM because I believed that money was going to come. Yeah. Like, I'm not actually exaggerating. Like, I'm going to make it worse.
Shoot the money out.
I'm going to make it worse because I was in Phoenix at the time. So I was at the ATM at both 9 p.m. and midnight. just
Oh, in case the East Coast didn't get taken down, it would just be the West Coast.
So just know that I'm dumb, we'll say. But the lesson there was, for expedience and without foresight, a lot of people that created code created it for the path of least resistance, the easiest way, the quickest way. And we had, I don't know how much the Y2K cost, basically recoding every single date on every single system at the time. And that was also in 2000. The size of the internet, the digital footprint of the world has got to be like hundreds of times bigger now compared to 1999.
Oh yeah, it's exponential now. I mean, I don't think the Internet of Things existed in 2000 as like a term that people know. And now, who doesn't have a Echo in their house, or a Google, whatever it's called? Who doesn't have like a smart TV, a smart?
I just threw out my Amazon Echo because she wasn't listening to me. Like, I would say stuff and she wouldn't, and I had to yell. And I was like, I need to throw her out. She's going deaf. And I threw her out. And I realized literally I was mad because she wasn't listening in enough at all the things going on in my life.
She doesn't predict what I want. I want her to be more intelligent.
Yeah. So let's say this. So what's on the horizon for in legislatures or at the national level for cybersecurity? Or I know what we've talked about, but what do you think is going to be coming down the next 10 or 15 years for cybersecurity on a national level?
So I think a couple things. I think that because of several events over the last couple of years, including, the several instances of interference with the elections, of people realizing that algorithms on Facebook and other sites result in certain things that can be dangerous. Look at how disinformation can be spread really easily on certain websites, and it might be planted by other sort of people trying to interfere. Then also look at the sort of infrastructure live hacks that we are seeing before our eyes that are still not resolved, that this pipeline is still not back up and running. So we're living the consequences of not prioritizing prevention and not being resilient and not investing in. It's like an insurance policy. You don't want to ever need it, and so maybe you let it lapse, but then when you need it, you're going to really wish that you still had it and that you'd been paying your premiums, because now you're stuck fixing something on your own, and you could have been investing into this all along, and it would have been a lot easier to bounce back from.
So if the federal government doesn't act soon or appropriately, couldn't a lot of this infrastructure runs through states? Couldn't states also say, hey, this can't go through our backyard unless you meet this standard for, we're going to, in order to get this, you're also required to meet this standard for cybersecurity. Is that a feasible workaround?
They definitely could. I mean, California already has its own laws that are more stringent than federal law for data privacy. Consumers in California have the most protection of any consumers in the United States. So it's definitely doable. But the problem is that some of these systems are in so many states, and the companies are nationwide usually that are running these kind of systems and things like that. So it's the size of the problem seems like it would be appropriate for the federal government to be the one to regulate, but it wouldn't be the first time that states had to regulate something that the federal government is not willing to do. So
well, maybe after this summer we'll have a talk about cannabis. Is that? It was real subtle, Christa. This summer, Christa's going to be working on some cannabis policy, so maybe it'll be a revisit, and we'll hear what she learned or thought. Never mind the fact that we could see a radical shift in federal prohibition against cannabis too, but that's a podcast for another day. The only way it relates to this is if you Google cannabis. That's the only way you can tie cybersecurity into cannabis on this podcast.
Yes.
But I guess before we go, do you have any sort of final thoughts? Especially, I want you to compare Christa before you did your research to Christa after your research, and then view it through that lens. Like, what do you wish you would have known this whole time?
So I wish I would have known that there is like a whole different way that the government could be prioritizing things, and it doesn't just extend to cybersecurity, and it doesn't just extend to infrastructure. It affects military, it affects our physical security. When you think about needing power, needing oil, last year we had toilet paper shortages. It's a very real physical impact of disruptions in supply chain and infrastructure. And I think I had no idea that something that I thought of as too abstract or too hard to understand, or, when I picked this topic, I really had very little understanding of cybersecurity at all, and what IT systems, I still don't know a lot of the technical stuff. I've read a lot of articles and sort of acquired enough to understand the basics, but there are people that understand all of that stuff, and they have a lot of better ideas than I do, I'm sure. And if we could just figure out how to get them all in a room and give them the tools they need to be successful, we'd be a lot better off. So it doesn't feel like a national security threat could be bigger than how vulnerable we really are as far as some of these really basic things. So
I agree. And I think that speaks to what you talked about towards the very beginning. Like, we don't realize it until something kind of pierces it. But our national infrastructure for essentially everything is really thin ice. When a pandemic hit, we ran out of toilet paper.
Yeah.
Like,
we make toilet paper in the US and we ran out.
Right. And when, and not to camp out too long, but this pipeline thing, there was a pipeline that had an issue back in Arizona in 2003. Some people might remember, maybe not, but it was essentially the same thing. This pipeline is no longer moving petroleum stuff up to the valley. There's going to be a gas shortage, and everyone ran out to fill up their vehicles. And Phoenix, population like 2 or 3 million or some crazy amount, was just slammed, and everyone ran out. Prices went through the roof. People were running out of gas, waiting in line. People were calling AAA just to give them 2 free gallons on the road. People were driving around with a truck that had like their own personal tank, and they were charging $20 a gallon. And the radio stations were like, every day they would say there's reports of gas at like 91st and Thunderbird. They would do call outs, and the whole city would swarm those places and clog the intersections. And then like after 2 or 3 weeks of this, where I was on base and they're like, okay, if only military members can get gas on base, retirees and civilians cannot, we're rationing it. And then like the report came out, oh, that pipeline only accounts for 7% of the gas in Phoenix. And the reason everything collapsed was because the way our system is designed, it's not designed for everyone to go out and ask for something at the same time, which is why we ran out of toilet paper, which is why we ran out of fuel then, which, by the way, is why we're running out of fuel now. Because that pipeline, under the ransomware thing, is also not the primary. But it's our logistical ecosystem in America is so thin. It's all like day of arrival. It's all orchestrated, that anything that pierces that dance or pierces that really thin sort of ice causes a catastrophic effect. And I think when you combine the understanding of how we are really laissez-faire about our cybersecurity at a government regulatory level, expecting companies to do it in their own best interest, while the companies are having this tension between their fiduciary duty and spending extra money on cybersecurity, to the fact that our infrastructure is very, very thin. I think for a state actor or a non-state actor, I think if you got a really malicious person, they could essentially, I mean, just think if power goes out, fuel goes out, and toilet paper shortages, and pick one other thing that's like food, a meat factory or something. If you hit all 4 of those things at once, it's going to be Lord of the Flies in America, and it's going to take us decades to recover.
It's kind of already happening just from an accumulation of things. There was some kind of pig virus over the winter that now there's a pork shortage apparently. And I mean, we're seeing sort of how fragile we are and interconnected we are, even as a global economy, from COVID and from resulting things from, you know, how climate change is affecting the weather, and, you know, getting ice storms in Texas all of a sudden. Now their power grid's down because they're not ready for ice storms. And I mean, it's really exposes how in so many areas we have not prioritized prevention of anything, and we haven't prioritized resilience. We fix our roads when the potholes are bad enough that people's cars get damaged, and then they sue the city, and so then they fix the pothole. It's like, it's not, we are not very good at prevention. We're reactive, and we pay for things when we need to, not when we should be preparing for something that may never happen.
Yeah, that's
fair. The tricky part. May never happen, but would be catastrophic if it did happen.
And then I also think, like, if we had spent this money on cybersecurity, if we had, I mean, I use this phrase a lot, if we had cooked it into the recipe for American cyber infrastructure when we were doing that Y2K stuff, like if we had gone and started regulating and requiring then, how much money would we have saved? Because the reality is we're going to spend, as I said, billions and billions of dollars to get America up to a standard, and then we have to maintain that standard. But if we delay a decade or two, it's going to cost by orders of magnitude more money to shore up more systems with higher technology. It needs to be something that we do sooner rather than later. And with that fragile infrastructure, the reality is we could be in some real dire straits if we don't do it. So other than that,
true.
I think that's it. So good job. Thanks, Christa. Adios.